She hadn't eaten in 4 days. The berries were small and dark, hanging off a dead bush at the edge of a frozen Wyoming road, and every instinct she had left told her they were wrong. Wrong color, wrong smell, wrong everything. Maren Holloway knew plants. She'd known them since she was a girl, and she knew these would probably kill her. She ate them anyway. That was the moment Gideon Ashcroft's wagon came around the bend. Not Salvation riding in on clean white horses, but a tired man on a tired horse who looked down at a woman crouched in the snow beside a poisonous bush and asked the strangest question she'd ever heard in her life. "Can you cook?" If you want to know how a starving widow on the edge of death ended up saving an entire cattle ranch, like this video, drop a comment with your city and let's see how far this story travels. The road into Caldwell Flats ran straight and mean through the Wyoming basin, cutting between sage flats and frozen creek beds like a scar that never healed right. In early November, it was already brutal. Wind that didn't gust so much as press, steady and cold, driving grit into the eyes of anyone foolish enough to be out in it on foot. Maren Holloway was out in it on foot. She'd been walking since first light, which at this time of year meant she'd been walking since the dark began to thin rather than truly break. Her boots had started separating at the left heel 2 days ago. She'd wrapped it in a strip torn from her underskirt, and the wrapping had held for a while, then soaked through, and now the heel of her left foot was just cold in a way that had stopped hurting and started feeling like nothing at all, which she understood was worse. She carried a canvas sack with a broken strap she held closed with her fist. Inside it, 1 tin cup, a change of stockings she was saving for when she found work, a small knife with a cracked handle, and a folded piece of paper that had been a letter once. She didn't read it anymore. She kept it because throwing it away felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. Her name before marriage had been Maren Cass. Her father had run a small farm outside Laramie, and her mother had been the kind of woman who knew the name of every plant within a 10-mile radius. What was safe, what was useful, what would put you in the ground if you looked at it sideways. Maren had inherited that knowledge the same way she'd inherited her mother's narrow hands and her father's jaw, without asking for it, without particularly valuing it, until the day she needed it. She'd married Thomas Holloway at 21 because he was steady and earnest, and because her father said a woman in Wyoming needed a man with land, and Thomas had 12 acres near the river bottom. They'd had 4 years. 4 years that weren't grand or romantic, but were real. Cold mornings and sunburned afternoons in a garden that produced better each season, and a small house that smelled like pine pitch and beeswax. Thomas wasn't much for talking, but he worked hard and he was kind, which Maren had come to understand was rarer than it should be. Then the fever came through in August, and Thomas was dead in 11 days. And 3 weeks after that, the bank took the land because there'd been a second note she hadn't known to ask about. And she was 25 years old with nothing but a canvas sack and boots that were already older than she wanted. She'd spent the better part of a year trying to make it work in Laramie. Washing, mending, a brief and miserable stint cleaning rooms at a hotel where the owner paid 2/3 of what he'd promised and grabbed at her twice before she put a laundry paddle across his forearm and quit. She'd done cooking work for a family named Pierce for 4 months. But the Pierces had decided to move back east before winter, and when they went fast, and their goodbye had included exactly $3 and an apology that didn't sit right with Maren, but which she took because $3 was $3. Now those $3 were long gone, the last of them spent on a room and a meal in a town called Trellis that she'd left 8 days ago, when it became clear there was nothing in Trellis for a woman without connections or references or money for a fresh start. She'd heard there was a town called Caldwell Flats another day's walk west, and past that, more ranches. And in ranch country, there was always work if you were willing and strong and didn't ask too much. She was willing, she was strong, or had been. She was in no position to ask too much of anyone. The bush was at the edge of where the road bent around a low bluff, half hidden in brown grass that had been crushed flat by snow and then exposed again by wind. She almost walked past it. What stopped her was a memory. Her mother's voice, very specific, from maybe 20 years ago. Those black ones, the shiny ones, some folks will eat those and be fine, and some folks will be sick for a week and some folks won't get up. She'd asked her mother which ones were which, and her mother had said, the ones on the dead bushes. Don't eat those. This bush was dead. Had been dead for a season at least, Bark gray and splitting, branches bare except for the clusters of small black berries that clung on the way, dead things sometimes do. Marin crouched down and looked at them for a long time. Her stomach had moved past the stage of cramping and into something quieter and more serious. Not pain exactly, more like an absence, a hollow pressure that made it hard to think straight. She'd had a handful of dried grass seeds the day before, which wasn't food but was something to chew. Before that, a small amount of creek water and half a biscuit she'd found wrapped in cloth on a fence post, left by someone or fallen from a wagon. Stale enough that she'd eaten only half of it before her stomach threatened to reject even that. She thought about her mother's warning. She thought about the fact that she was 4 days out of anything that reasonably qualified as food, that her foot might already be frostbitten, that the wind was not getting warmer, and that Caldwell Flats was at least another 4 hours away if her estimate of distance was right, which it might not be. She ate 6 berries, chewed them slowly, tasted something dark and faintly bitter, and then sat back on her heels in the dead grass and waited to see what happened. What happened was that she heard a wagon. Quiet. Gideon Ashcroft was coming back from Trellis, which was where he went roughly once a month to deal with matters he couldn't handle by post. The farrier bill dispute that had dragged on since September, a conversation with the land office about the eastern fence line, and a stop at the dry goods store for items his foreman had put on the supply list. He had a list of 8 things from the store, and he'd managed to acquire 6 of them, which felt about right for a trip to Trellis. He was 41 years old and had been running the Ashcroft Ranch, which his father had started and which he had expanded and nearly lost twice and then stabilized, for going on 16 years. He was not a tall man, but he was broad through the shoulders in the way of men who've spent decades at physical work, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked harder than it was. He didn't smile often, not because he was unfriendly, but because smiling had always felt like something he had to remember to do, rather than something that happened naturally. He had a foreman named Ruck, who did most of the day-to-day running of the hands. He had 19 cowboys on payroll, which was more than he strictly needed and less than he needed when winter hit hard. He had 460 cattle he was trying to get through November and December without losing too many to cold or disease or the creek bottoms that turned lethal when they froze wrong. He had a loan payment due in March that he tried not to think about too directly, because when he thought about it directly, it made him feel something close to panic, which was not useful. What he did not have was a cook. His last cook, a man named Devereaux, had broken 3 fingers on his left hand in a rope incident 2 weeks ago and gone back to his sister's place in Cheyenne to heal up. Before Devereaux, it had been a woman named Holst who'd lasted 3 months before deciding ranch cooking wasn't for her. Before Holst, it had been a rotating series of cowboys who took turns burning things and complaining about it, which was where the ranch was again now, and the result was that his men were eating badly and sleeping badly and working badly, and Gideon had been thinking about the cook problem the entire drive back from Trellis without arriving at any solution. He came around the bend in the road and saw the woman. She was crouched in the dead grass beside a bush, and for a moment he thought she was just resting. Travelers sometimes stopped here because the bluff cut the wind. But something was wrong with the picture. She wasn't sitting normally. She was crouched in the way people crouched when they didn't have the strength to sit up straight, and as the wagon came even with her, she looked up and he saw her face. She was maybe mid-20s, dark hair that had mostly escaped whatever it had been pinned in. The kind of thin that wasn't a natural thinness, but an imposed one. The thinness of someone who hadn't been eating, and her eyes were... He stopped the wagon. "Ma'am." He kept his voice level, the way he talked to spooked horses. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said, which was such an obvious lie that he didn't bother responding to it. He climbed down from the wagon seat, which was not something he usually did for strangers, and looked at the bush she was crouched beside. He knew that bush. He'd known it since he was a boy riding this road with his father. "Those'll make you sick," he said. "I know." "You know, and you ate them anyway?" She looked at him with a steadiness that he found unexpectedly striking, given everything. "I didn't eat many." He looked at her boots. He looked at the canvas sack. He looked at the hollow under her cheekbones that didn't come from one missed meal or 2. He was not, by nature, an impulsive man. He thought things through, ran numbers in his head, considered consequences. He'd learned that lesson early and hard, and it had served him well. But there were moments when thinking too long was its own kind of mistake, and this felt like one of them. "Can you cook?" he said. She blinked. It was the most emotion her face had shown. "Can I... what?" "Cook, make food. I've got 19 hungry men and no cook, and I'm 2 weeks behind on where I should be because of it." He paused. "I'm asking if that's something you know how to do." She stared at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read what was happening behind her eyes. Then she said, "Yes." "You got somewhere to be? Somewhere you're heading?" "Caldwell Flats. I was hoping to find work." "Work's here if you want it. Fair wages, a room with a lock on the door, and you eat what everyone else eats." He said that last part deliberately, so she understood it. "I'm not asking about your past or where you came from. I'm asking if you can cook and if you want the work." She got to her feet. It cost her something. He could see that. But she did it without reaching for him or the wagon wheel, just stood up on her own and looked at him directly. "My name is Marin Holloway," she said. "Gideon Ashcroft. My ranch is about 6 miles west." He nodded toward the wagon. "You should sit down before those berries change their mind about you." She didn't get sick from the berries. She wasn't sure if that was luck or constitution, or the fact that she hadn't eaten enough of them to do real damage. What she did get, sitting on the wagon bench wrapped in a horse blanket Gideon Ashcroft produced from somewhere behind the seat, was warm for the first time in 4 days, and the combination of warmth and the low rolling motion of the wagon sent her into something that wasn't quite sleep, but was close enough that she surfaced from it only when the wagon stopped. The ranch sat at the edge of a broad flat that opened up behind a ridge of lodgepole pines. It was bigger than she'd expected. A main house that was plain but solid, a bunkhouse that was clearly newer, a barn with a hayloft and 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral where several horses stood in the fading afternoon light. The whole place had the look of somewhere that was fighting a losing battle against entropy. Fences that needed mending, a pile of lumber near the barn that had been sitting long enough to weather, a gate hanging slightly wrong on its post. But it was standing. It was occupied and alive, and there was smoke coming from the main house chimney, and Marin, who had spent the last several months scaling down her expectations of what surviving looked like, thought, "This will do." "Kitchen's through here," Gideon said, leading her around the side of the main house without ceremony or introduction. He pushed open a side door, and she stepped into a room that smelled like old grease and wood smoke and something faintly soured, and she understood immediately why the ranch's cooking situation had collapsed. The kitchen was a working disaster. Not dirty, exactly. There was evidence that someone had tried to keep it functional, but disorganized in a deep systemic way that went beyond messiness into something structural. Supplies were stacked without logic. A 50-pound sack of flour propped against a wall where moisture could reach the bottom, dried beans stored in 3 different containers of different sizes, a side of salt pork hanging where the heat from the stove would hit it wrong. The stove itself was a good one, iron, with a double oven, but the firebox door had a slight warp that would affect heat distribution. There were good knives and bad knives jumbled together, and the cutting surface had been used for things it shouldn't have been used for. She walked through it slowly, the way her mother had taught her to walk through an unfamiliar kitchen, looking, not touching yet, just reading what was there. "How many men do you feed?" she asked. 19 plus myself, 20 total. 3 meals a day? Breakfast and dinner, usually. Sometimes something midday if they're not too far out. Who's been doing the cooking? 2 men taking turns. They hate it and they're bad at it, which doesn't help either problem. He paused. Biscuits 2 nights ago came out like stones. Good ones would have bounced. She turned and looked at him. He wasn't joking exactly, but there was something dry in the way he'd said it. Something that suggested he was capable of dry. She noted that. "I'll need to reorganize this," she said. "Not tonight, but before I can work properly. The flour's going to mold where it's sitting. The salt pork needs to move." "All right. I'll want a list of what's in the supply shed and what's coming in next order." "I can have that for you tomorrow." "I'll also need to know what the men won't eat. Everybody's got something." He thought about it. "Ruck. That's my foreman. He can't eat onions. Not an allergy, just makes him miserable. And then everyone around him is miserable. Martinez, one of my riders, is Catholic, doesn't eat meat on Fridays. The rest will eat most things if it's hot, and there's enough of it." Marin nodded. She was cataloging, already thinking forward. "Dinner tonight. What do you have? Potatoes, dried beans that have been soaking since this morning, I think, some smoked ham, whatever else you can find. That's enough, she said. He looked at her the way she was coming to recognize as his default expression, watchful, measuring, not unfriendly. You haven't eaten today. I'll eat when the men eat. That's how it works, she said. Firm, without aggression. I don't eat first. I eat when I know everyone's had enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There's bread from yesterday in the box there. It's not going to make it to tomorrow anyway. Eat some of that while you work. Nobody's going without their dinner because you have half a loaf of yesterday's bread. It was the most she'd heard him say at once. She picked up the bread, which was slightly hard but fine, and took a bite while she started pulling open cabinets to see what she actually had to work with. The first dinner was nothing special. Bean soup with smoked ham, skillet cornbread, roasted potatoes with salt, and the dried herbs she found in a jar at the back of a shelf. Someone had put them up once and forgotten about them. It took her 90 minutes, and she plated it ugly because she was working with serving vessels she hadn't learned yet, and her hands were still shaky from cold and exhaustion. But it was hot. It was seasoned. There was enough of it. She stood at the door of the cookhouse, a lean-to attachment off the main kitchen where the ranch hands ate, and watched them file in. 19 men who looked tired and cold, and mostly like they'd been eating badly for weeks. A few of them glanced at her with curiosity, a couple with something more guarded. One of them, a heavy-set man with a dense brown beard, looked at the soup and then at her and said, flat, Is this better than the last stuff? Try it, she said. He tried it. He didn't say anything else, which she took as a reasonable first result. The man she figured was the foreman sat at the end of the long table. He was maybe 50, with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a lot of years outdoors. When he finished his bowl, he looked up and said, to no one in particular, That's actual food, which made a few of the younger men laugh, and the tension in the room, which Marin hadn't fully registered until it eased, came down several degrees. She cleaned the kitchen after everyone was gone. She moved slowly because she was tired and because her foot, warming up now, had started hurting badly. She rearranged what she could move quickly, made a list of what needed to be reorganized tomorrow, found a pot that leaked from a crack she could probably fix with a wedge of tallow, and finally, when the kitchen was clean enough that she could find things in it, sat down at the small work table in the corner and ate her own bowl of the soup. It was cold by then. She ate it anyway, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in months, not because it was good food. It was plain. It was basic. It was just beans and pork and cornbread. But because she had made it herself, in a kitchen she would clean and organize and run, and she had work again, and she had a room with a lock on the door. The room was off the main house, smaller than a closet by some standards, with a cot and a wool blanket and a small shelf for her things. She locked the door, sat on the cot, and looked at the canvas sack on the shelf. She didn't think about Thomas. She was too tired to think about Thomas, which was sometimes a mercy. She thought about the morning, what she'd make for breakfast, how she'd move the flour without making a mess, whether the warp in the firebox door could be shimmed or whether she'd have to work around it. She thought about the 19 men she'd fed tonight, and the 20 she'd feed tomorrow, and the 100 small adjustments that would turn this broken kitchen into a place where she knew where everything was, and everything was where it should be. She was asleep before she'd finished the thought. Morning came before light, which was how mornings worked in a working kitchen. She was up at 4:30, not because she'd set any kind of alarm, but because she'd always woken early, some internal clock that hadn't needed winding since she was a girl. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back tightly. She had strong feelings about loose hair in a kitchen, and went to work. Breakfast for 20 was a different animal from dinner. Dinner you could take time with. Breakfast had to arrive fast and hot and sufficient before men went out into cold weather for 10 or 12 hours, and it had to be substantial enough to matter. She made oatmeal with dried apple, which she found in a crock behind the flour, and fried salt pork cut thin so it went further, and biscuits that she made from scratch because the only biscuits she'd eat were ones she'd made herself. The biscuits took the most time. She'd been making them since she was 9 years old, and her hands knew the process without input from her brain. The right amount of fat, worked in with the fingers until the mixture looked right, not too much handling after the liquid went in, into the oven while the heat was still building so the bottoms didn't burn before the tops were done. She knew how to adjust for altitude, for dry air, for an oven that ran hot on the left side, which this one did. The first man through the door at 5:30 was the heavyset one from the night before. He stopped when he smelled the biscuits, and his expression did something complicated. "Those fresh?" he said. "Just out," she said. He sat down without another word and ate 4 biscuits with his oatmeal, which Marin counted as a successful opening. The foreman, Ruck, she'd confirmed his name from a brief conversation the night before, came in at 5:45 and moved through the line with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd been feeding himself in field conditions for 30 years. He took his tray and sat and ate, and when he was done, he carried his dishes back to her window, which not all of them did. "Holloway," he said. She'd told him her name the night before. "You eat yet?" "I'll eat when the rush clears." "Rush is clear. It's 6 o'clock." He set his own dishes down. "Sit down and eat something before you fall over." She started to say something about the cleanup, and he looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was definitive. "I've got a man who can carry hot water. He'll do the heavy lifting on cleanup while you eat. Sit down." She sat down. Ruck remained at the table while she ate. He wasn't making conversation exactly. He was a man of few words, she was already learning, but he was there in a way that felt deliberate, like he was making a point about something without saying it out loud. "How long the ranch been without a cook?" she asked. "Devereaux left the 14th, so 2 weeks." "What were they eating?" "You don't want to know." "I do, actually. I need to know what kind of hole I'm digging out of." He considered that. First week, Tanner and Hayes took turns. Neither one of them can cook, but they're prideful, so they wouldn't admit that, which meant everything came out worse than if they just admitted they didn't know what they were doing and kept it simple. Second week, after Tanner nearly put a man down with the soup, Mr. Ashcroft started riding into Caldwell Flats to get food from the boarding house there, which cost money and took time and still left the men hungry because boarding house portions aren't ranch portions. So they've been underfed for 2 weeks. Yes. That's why the productivity dropped. Ruck looked at her for a moment. "Mr. Ashcroft told you about the productivity?" "He didn't have to. You can see it in the men." She nodded toward the door. "They're moving slow. Not lazy slow, depleted slow. That fixes itself inside a week if the food's right." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the same measuring quality she'd seen in Gideon Ashcroft's face yesterday, a quality she was beginning to understand was just how this ranch looked at new things. "Where'd you work before?" he asked. "I had my own kitchen. Before that, a family in Laramie." "You run supply lists?" "I'll need to. Can you get me an accurate count of what's in the shed?" "By this afternoon." "Good." She finished the last of her biscuit and stood up. "I want to reorganize the storage situation today. Some of what's in there is going to spoil wrong if it sits where it is." Ruck stood as well. "I'll send you the man for cleanup." He started toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Holloway." "Yes." "Those biscuits." He stopped, seemed to decide something. Devereaux couldn't make a biscuit. 2 years he was here. He went out without explaining what he meant by that, but she understood it anyway. The first full week was work that used everything she had. She spent the first 2 days reorganizing the storage systems from the ground up, which was physical labor as much as anything else. Moving sacks of grain and flour and dried goods, wiping down shelves that had never been wiped, relocating the salt pork to where the temperature was right, building a system of organized bins that meant she could put her hand on any ingredient in 15 seconds without thinking about it. The stove she couldn't fix, but she learned it. Every stove had its own personality, where it ran hot, where it cooled unevenly, what the firebox needed to hold a steady heat through a long braise. This one liked more fuel than she expected, ran cool on the right side oven, had a hot spot at the back of the main surface where things burned if she forgot. She mapped it mentally the way she'd mapped every other stove she'd ever worked on, and by the 3rd day she was using it like she'd had it for years. The men's eating patterns she cataloged as carefully as the ingredients. Some ate fast and wanted volume. Some were picky in specific ways. An older cowboy named Jed Walsh had bad teeth and needed things that weren't hard to chew. She started making sure there was always something soft alongside the harder fare. A young man named Danny Pratt, couldn't have been more than 18 from the look of him, ate almost nothing at breakfast but could put away an extraordinary amount at dinner, which told her something about how his digestion worked and let her plan accordingly. She stretched the supplies in ways she hadn't had to since the lean years of her own farm. The trick wasn't having enough. The Ashcroft Ranch had decent stores, better than she'd expected. It was making the most of what she had so that the men felt fed, felt satisfied, felt like they'd eaten well rather than merely eaten. That meant fat in the right places, salt at the right level, texture and variation so the same basic ingredients didn't become invisible through repetition. The bean soup she'd made that first night became a base. She ran it different ways, with ham one night, with dried chili the next, with the last of a smoked sausage she found in the back of the cold room the third night. The men didn't notice they were eating variations on the same thing because each version tasted distinct. That was craft, not magic. Her mother had called it feeding the memory as much as the stomach. On the fifth day, Gideon Ashcroft appeared in the kitchen doorway at mid-morning when the breakfast cleanup was done, and she was already starting on dinner prep. "How are you managing?" he asked. "Better than the first 2 days. I've gotten the storage sorted." "I saw that." He looked around the kitchen, which was now organized in a way that was visibly different from when she'd arrived. "Ruck says the men are working better. They're eating better. That's the connection." He came in and stood at the edge of the workspace, not in her way, but close enough that they were talking rather than projecting. "I wanted to ask, what do you need that you haven't got?" She'd been keeping a list. She pulled it from the small notebook she'd found in a drawer and used now for supply tracking. "Vinegar. More of it. You've got some, but not enough. Salt pork's getting low, so that needs to be on the next order. I'd like dried mushrooms if the supplier in Caldwell Flats carries them. They make a difference in the winter stews. And I need a large pot. The biggest one I've got has got a crack that I've been working around, but it's going to fail." He looked at the list without taking it. "All of that's reasonable. I'll have Ruck add it to the order." A pause. "The pot I'll take care of when I'm next in town. One other thing." "Go ahead." "The flour storage. The way it was when I got here, half that sack was going to mold by spring. I moved it, but you're going to need a proper storage box, sealed, off the floor. I can build one if I have the lumber and the time, or I can tell you how to have it built." He looked at her. "You can build a storage box?" "I built most of the shelving in my own farm kitchen." She said it without particular pride. It was just a fact. "My husband wasn't handy. I learned." It was the first time she'd mentioned anything personal, and she felt it land in the air between them. Not heavy, exactly, but present. "I'll get you the lumber," he said, "and the time." He left without asking about the husband, which she appreciated more than she could easily say. Chaps! The rhythm of the ranch was something that took time to understand from the inside. From the outside, a cattle operation looked like organized simplicity. Animals, land, men. From the inside, it was a clockwork of interdependencies where everything affected everything else, where a sick animal at one end of the operation created ripples you felt in the kitchen 3 days later, where the weather could rewrite the entire schedule with 12 hours' notice. She started to see the patterns around the end of the first week. The roundup, the final push to gather the herd and verify numbers before the hard winter, was scheduled to start in 9 days. It would mean longer days, colder conditions, men who'd be out before light and back after dark, and needed more calories to sustain what they were doing than they could get from 3 normal meals. It would mean breakfast before 4:30, a midday supply of food she'd need to pack and send out, dinner that was substantial enough to close out a day that would leave the men near their physical limits. She mentioned this to Ruck on the 6th day. "The roundup starts when?" 9 days, depending on weather. "I need to build up supplies before then. The current inventory won't carry 20 men through a hard roundup week without either rationing or restocking midweek, and midweek restocking wastes time." Ruck looked at her steadily. "You worked a roundup before?" "I lived one. My husband ran cattle. Small operation, nothing like this, but the principle's the same." "What do you need?" "A bigger order. Now, before the push, so it's here before we need it. I've got the list broken down by day if you want to look at it." She'd spent 2 nights on that list. She had the current inventory figured to the pound, a daily estimate of what 20 men working hard in cold weather needed to function, and a calculated buffer for the variables she couldn't predict. It was the kind of math that looked simple but wasn't. It required knowing your supplies, knowing your men, knowing what weather did to appetite and what exhaustion did to digestion. Ruck took the list and looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll show this to Mr. Ashcroft. Is there a problem with the amount? The amount is the amount, he said, which wasn't exactly an answer. I'll show it to Mr. Ashcroft. Gideon came to the kitchen that evening. He had the list in his hand and he set it on the counter and said, "Walk me through this." She did. She explained each line item, why she'd estimated what she'd estimated, where she'd built in buffer, and why. She explained the difference between feeding men who were cold and tired and feeding men who were cold and tired and doing sustained physical work, which was a larger difference than most people appreciated. She showed him where she could economize if she had to, and where economizing would cost more than it saved. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at the list again, then at her. "You did this in 2 days," he said. "I've been keeping the inventory since I got here. It wasn't hard once I had the numbers." "Where'd you learn to think like this?" "My mother managed everything on the farm. Everything. My father was a good farmer, but he had no head for numbers, and she knew it, so she did it." She paused. She made sure I knew it, too. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the kitchen's one window in its frame. "I'll approve the order," he said. "In full." "Thank you." He picked up the list and then didn't immediately leave. He stood there for a moment, the list held at his side, looking at something she couldn't identify. Maybe the organized shelves, maybe the state of the kitchen, maybe nothing in particular. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Marin is fine." He nodded once. "Marin!" The word sat differently than Mrs. Holloway had. "The men are already working better. I don't know if you've noticed." "I noticed. That's the food." "Ruck thinks it's more than the food." She didn't say anything to that. "I'm just saying, what you're doing here is making a difference that goes past the kitchen." He seemed slightly uncomfortable with the statement, like he'd meant to say something smaller and it had come out larger. "I wanted you to know that. I'll let you know after the roundup," she said. "That'll be the real test." He almost smiled. It was quick, and it didn't quite make it all the way to his eyes, but it was there. "Fair enough," he said, and left. She turned back to the cutting board, and she let herself, just for a moment, feel the things she'd been carefully not feeling for a week. Not happiness, exactly. That was too much of a word for where she was and what she had. Something smaller and more specific. The feeling of being in the right place. The feeling of being useful in a way that was real and visible, that showed up in how men walked and worked and ate. She'd lost a farm, a husband, almost a year, and nearly her life on the side of a frozen road. She picked up the knife and went back to work. It was on the 8th day that she first heard the name Silas Kincaid. She wasn't meant to hear it. She was in the small hallway off the main room of the house, bringing a tray of coffee that Gideon had asked for before the accounting work he did on Tuesday evenings. And she paused outside the door because she could hear Ruck's voice inside, low and serious in a way that she'd come to recognize as distinct from his normal tone. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was about to knock, but the words came through the door before she could. "Due in March," Ruck was saying. "That's not much time, and if Kincaid pushes the bank before then, Kincaid can't push anything until the note's past due." Gideon's voice was flat in a specific way, controlled flat. "He pushed the Harmon place last year. Harmon wasn't past due either, technically, when the bank started making noises about reviewing the terms. I know about the Harmon place. I'm just saying, if he starts talking to Patterson at the bank, the terms can change. That's happened before." A silence. "I know," Gideon said. "I know." Marin knocked. Gideon said, "Come in," and she came in and set the coffee down and looked at neither of them directly. Ruck left without acknowledging her, which wasn't his usual way. Gideon picked up the coffee and didn't say anything. "Thank you," she said, meaning it as an exit. "Marin." She stopped. "Don't concern yourself with what you just heard. It wasn't unfriendly, it was just clear. It's a business matter." "Of course," she said. She went back to the kitchen and set her hands flat on the counter and stood there for a moment. Due in March. If Kincaid pushes the bank. A ranch loan. A creditor pushing. A deadline coming. She thought about the supply list she'd built, the careful counting, the numbers that had to add up just right to get through the winter and the roundup. She thought about the inventory she'd been keeping, and she thought about the financial picture that those numbers, looked at in a certain way, would tell you. She wasn't concerned, not yet. It wasn't her business. He'd said it clearly, and he was right. She picked up her knife and went back to work. And she did not think about Silas Kincaid for the rest of that night, but she did not entirely not think about him either. The roundup started 8 days after she arrived, which was 1 day earlier than scheduled because the weather forecast said something no one liked. She was up at 3:45 that morning and had breakfast going by 4. By 4:30, the men were coming in quiet and purposeful, the particular focused energy of people beginning something hard and necessary. She fed them well, better than well. She sent them out with full stomachs, proper biscuits, coffee that was strong and hot and ready in quantity, a side of fried salt pork that she'd stretched by slicing thin and frying crisp so it went further without feeling sparse. She watched them go out into the cold dark and thought, hold up under it. You've got enough in you to hold up under it. That afternoon she packed food for the midday stop. Cold biscuits with thick bacon, dried apple tied in cloth packets, strong cold coffee in sealed flasks. She gave it to the young man named Danny Pratt, who was riding it out, and she gave it to him carefully packed so nothing would spill or freeze, and she told him, make sure Walsh gets the softer biscuits. They're in the cloth on the left. Danny looked at her like she'd said something surprising, and then said, yes, ma'am, and rode out. Standing in the yard watching him go, with the cold settling in around her and the smoke from the kitchen chimney rising straight up into still air, she thought for the first time since arriving that maybe, just maybe, this place was beginning to feel like something other than a temporary solution. She went back inside. There was dinner to think about, a tired crew coming home in the dark, 20 men who were going to need more than just food. They needed to come home to something that felt like enough. She would make sure it was. The roundup lasted 6 days. Marin didn't sleep more than 4 hours any night of it. She was up before 4 every morning, and the last light in the kitchen was hers, burning past 10 when the cleanup was done and the prep for the next day was laid out, and she'd finally let herself sit down with whatever was left in the pot and eat standing over the stove, because sitting felt like admitting the day was over, and the day wasn't over until she said it was. By the 3rd day, she had the rhythm of it locked in. Breakfast at 4:30, packed midday food out by 8, with whoever was riding supply, dinner on the table at 6:30 regardless of what the afternoon had done to her plans. She learned that plans were a guideline on a working ranch, not a promise. Twice she had the dinner nearly ready when weather or a problem with the herd pushed the men's return back by an hour, and both times she held the temperature on everything without letting quality slide, which required attention and a particular kind of patience she'd developed over years of feeding people who couldn't tell her when they'd be hungry. The men came in at the end of those days looking used up. Not dramatically. These were men accustomed to hard work, and they didn't complain. But she could read the specific quality of their exhaustion and how they moved, how they sat, how long it took them to form full sentences. Cold weather cattle work was particular in the damage it did. Not just physical fatigue, but something that went into the bones and the eyes, a tiredness that food could partially address if the food was right. She made sure the food was right. On the 4th night, she put a beef and root vegetable stew on the table, the last of the remaining beef cuts she'd been saving, stretched with turnips and carrots and a handful of dried mushrooms from the order that had arrived 2 days before. The mushrooms had cost extra, and she'd justified them to Ruck as flavor extenders, which was true, but the real reason was that mushrooms in broth made something that tasted like it had been worked over for hours, tasted like effort and care. And after 4 days of roundup, the men needed to taste that somebody had put effort and care into their food. Jed Walsh, the older hand with the bad teeth, finished his bowl and pushed it slightly forward on the table, which she'd noticed was his way of indicating he'd want more if there was more. She refilled it without being asked. He looked up at her briefly. Didn't say anything, but his eyes said something. She went back to the kitchen and found she had to stand still for a moment with her hands pressed flat on the counter. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was something more practical than sentiment, the recognition that this was what she was built for. Not the physical work, though she was capable of that. The reading of people, the adjustment to what they needed, the satisfaction of the gap between what was there and what could be done with it. Thomas had known this about her. He'd said it once, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation. You fix things, Marin. That's what you do. Walk into a broken situation and start fixing it before you've even unpacked. She'd argued at the time because she wasn't sure fixing everything was always the right instinct. But she thought about it now, in this kitchen that had been broken when she arrived and was no longer broken, and she thought maybe Thomas had seen her clearly. On the fifth day, the shoulder happened. She heard the commotion from the kitchen, not shouting, which would have been less alarming, but the specific controlled urgency of men dealing with something serious. She wiped her hands and went to the doorway. Two of the younger hands were half carrying a third man across the yard. She recognized him as Cole Barker, 22 or 23, one of the better riders, a quiet man who made a point of thanking her after meals, which she'd noticed and appreciated. He was holding his left arm at an angle that was immediately and obviously wrong. His face was the gray-white color of pain that had moved past sharp and into systemic. The men carrying him were moving toward the bunkhouse. Marin was already crossing the yard. "What happened?" she said. "Horse spooked on the ice," one of the men said. Torres, she thought his name was. He went down hard on the left side. She stepped in front of them and looked at Cole's shoulder. She didn't touch it, not yet. She looked. The arm was displaced forward and down, which meant the humeral head had come out anteriorly. Forward dislocation, which was the most common type and the most fixable if you knew what you were doing. She'd seen it twice. Once on her neighbor's son when she was 17, and once on Thomas himself, who'd gone off a roof he shouldn't have been on. Her mother had set the neighbor boy's shoulder in about 90 seconds with a method she'd learned from an older woman who'd ranched near the Platte River before Marin was born. Thomas's had taken longer because Thomas had panicked, which made the muscles harder to work with. The nearest doctor was in Caldwell Flats, 12 miles away. She did not know how bad the roads were right now. She knew that a shoulder left unreduced for hours became harder to set as the muscles tightened, and that this young man's face was saying he was approaching the limit of what he could absorb before shock became a real concern. "Bring him inside," she said. "Kitchen table." Torres looked at her. "We should get the doc. The doc is 12 miles in questionable conditions, and this shoulder needs to go back in now, not in 3 hours." She looked at Cole directly. "Do you want to wait 3 hours?" Cole's jaw was tight. "No, ma'am." "Then come inside." They brought him in, and she cleared the end of the kitchen table, had them help him sit, and then stood in front of him and talked to him in a low, even voice, while she ran her hands over the joint to confirm what she'd thought she'd seen. "I'm going to need you to tell me if anything I do changes the pain in a specific way," she said. "Not just hurts, changes. Can you do that?" "Yes." His voice was strained but steady. "Good." She looked at Torres and the other man. "One of you go find Ruck, the other one stay here and hold his other shoulder still. Not hard. Just steady." Torres left. The other man, whose name she thought was Perkins, stationed himself behind Cole and put careful hands on his right shoulder. She'd watched her mother do this twice and done it herself once, and all 3 times the principle had been the same. Relaxation was the key, not force. A shoulder that had dislocated anteriorly would go back in with relatively modest manipulation if the surrounding muscles weren't fighting you, and the muscles wouldn't fight you if the patient trusted you, and the patient wouldn't trust you if you were tense or uncertain or in a hurry. So she was none of those things. She took her time. She kept talking. "How long you been on this ranch?" she said. Cole blinked. The question had clearly surprised him. 3 years? You like it? Most of it. What's the part you don't like? He almost laughed, which was exactly what she'd wanted. A moment of something other than the pain, a second of relaxed engagement. "The fences," he said. "Never liked fence work." "Nobody likes fence work," she said, and in the same breath as he was exhaling the small laugh, she applied the traction and rotation she needed, a smooth, controlled movement that required her whole body behind it, not just her hands, and the joint relocated with a sound that made Perkins wince. Cole made a short, choked noise. Then he went very still. "Done," she said. He turned his head slowly and looked at his shoulder, moved his arm, cautiously. His face changed, the gray-white quality fading, color coming back, and with the color a particular expression that she'd seen on Thomas's face and the neighbor boy's face, and which meant the same thing each time, the relief of a pain that had become so fundamental you'd forgotten what not feeling it was like. He stopped. Tried again. That's better. It's going to be sore for several days. You shouldn't do heavy work with that arm for at least a week. She was already moving to the shelf for the cloth she'd used to make a sling. I'll wrap it, but you need to keep it still. The joint's back where it belongs, but the tissue around it is angry. Ruck arrived at the door as she was tying the sling. He took in the scene with the swift inventory of a man who was accustomed to assessing situations quickly and said nothing for a moment. She put it back in, Perkins said, with the specific tone of someone reporting something they weren't entirely sure they'd witnessed correctly. Ruck looked at Cole. Cole nodded. Ruck looked at Marin. She finished the knot on the sling and said without looking up, "He needs to be off heavy work for a week. If the pain changes significantly or the arm goes numb, someone needs to ride for the doctor." "Where'd you learn that?" Ruck said. "My mother." She stepped back and looked at Cole. "Can you eat?" He looked slightly stunned. Yes. Dinner's in 2 hours. Come and eat. Food helps." He came to dinner that night with his arm in the sling, and when he came through the line, she gave him the extra portion she'd set aside, and when he looked at her, she just nodded toward the table and he went and sat down. Across the room, she saw the way the other men looked at him, and then looked at her, and then looked at each other. She couldn't read all of what was in that exchange, but she understood enough of it. Something had shifted. The roundup ended on the 6th day, an hour before sunset, when Ruck came in and confirmed the count and said the number out loud in the kitchen doorway where she was standing, and the number was good. Not perfect. 2 animals lost to a frozen creek crossing on day 3, which Gideon had taken quietly and hard, but strong enough to enter winter with confidence. Gideon came to the kitchen that evening after dinner was done and the men had gone back to the bunkhouse. He came in and sat at the work table, which he'd never done before, always stood, always maintained the slight formal distance of an employer in his own kitchen. He sat down and she poured coffee without asking and set it in front of him and sat down across from him, also without asking. 6 days, he said. It went well. 2 animals. 2 animals, she agreed. In those conditions, on those crossings, that's not a disaster. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Martinez says Cole Barker would have been in bad shape if you hadn't. Martinez is probably right about the timing, she said. The shoulder would have been harder to reduce after a few hours. Where did you learn to do that? My mother, she considered how to put it. She was practical. There were no doctors near where we grew up. You learned to handle what you could handle. He looked at her for a moment. She'd noticed that he didn't look away when he was thinking, which was different from most people. Most people looked away when they were processing something, gave you the courtesy of their gaze's absence. He looked directly and steadily, which she'd initially found slightly uncomfortable and had come to find simply his way. I need to ask you something, he said. All right. Are you planning to stay through winter? She hadn't expected the question to land the way it did. She'd been so focused on the immediate work, on the roundup, and the supplies and the day-to-day demands of the kitchen that she hadn't thought forward in the way the question required. She'd been surviving in increments, the way you did when you'd been surviving for long enough. I plan to stay through winter, yes, she said. If the work's still there, the work's there. He seemed to want to say something more and was measuring it. I want you to know what you've done in 2 weeks, the inventory system, the supply planning, the men working better. He stopped, started again. I've had this ranch for 16 years, and I've never had a cook who thought about it the way you think about it. Cooking is just logistics, she said. People forget that. It looks like craft. But underneath the craft, it's numbers and planning and resource management, same as anything else on a ranch. Devereaux didn't think that way. Devereaux put the flour next to the damp wall. Devereaux wasn't thinking about the system. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across Gideon's face. No, he wasn't. She picked up her own coffee, which was cold by now, but she drank it anyway. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The loan, the one due in March. She watched his face change slightly and held up a hand. I'm not asking the details. I'm asking if the ranch's financial situation is something I should factor into the supply orders going forward. I don't want to over-order if there's a reason to be conservative. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then, where did you hear about the loan? The hallway. 2 weeks ago. I wasn't listening. I was bringing the coffee tray. She met his eyes directly. I should have told you I'd heard something. I didn't. That was wrong of me, and I'm telling you now. Another pause. He turned the cup in his hands again. The loan is being managed, he said finally. You don't need to cut the orders. All right, but... He stopped. If you saw something in the supply numbers that concerned you, about the broader financial picture, would you tell me? She looked at him for a moment. Yes? Even if you thought I wouldn't want to hear it? Especially then. He nodded, once, slowly, the way he nodded when he'd come to a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Then yes, the loan situation it's a concern. March isn't far, and there are factors outside the ranch itself that make it more complicated than it ought to be. He said the last part with a flatness that told her there was more to it than he was saying. She filed the information carefully, said nothing further about it. The supply orders are appropriate, she said, bringing it back to practical ground. I'm not over-ordering. If anything, I've been slightly conservative on the protein because I wanted to see how the men's consumption patterns ran before I committed to quantities. And now that you've seen them? I'll adjust up slightly on the next order. Nothing dramatic. He finished his coffee and stood. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the kitchen the way he'd looked at it before, taking inventory of something she couldn't see but felt was the space itself, how it had changed. The men respect you, he said. It came out like he hadn't planned to say it. They respect the food, she said. That's not all they respect. He picked up his hat from where he'd left it on the table. Cole Barker told everyone at the bunkhouse tonight that you're the reason his arm still works. You know that's going around. I know. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. No, but I don't want it to become the main thing they think about when they think about me. I'm the cook. That's what I'm here for. The shoulder was one afternoon. Sometimes one afternoon is what people remember. She had nothing to say to that. He put his hat on and said goodnight and went out. And she sat with the cold coffee and thought about what he'd said and about the name Kincaid that she'd filed in the back of her mind 2 weeks ago and hadn't forgotten. Factors outside the ranch itself. She thought about the inventory she'd been building, the careful count of what came in and what went out, the running tally of costs against what the supply orders showed. She wasn't looking at the ranch's finances. That wasn't her job. That wasn't any part of what she'd been hired to do. But numbers had a way of telling you things if you were paying attention, and she'd been paying attention. She washed the coffee cups and put them away and told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself that twice, which was probably once more than she should have needed to. The weeks after the roundup settled into a rhythm that was harder than before, but more predictable. The cold came in steadily, day by day, and with it came the particular demands of a ranch in deep winter. Animals that needed more watching, men who came in colder and needed more warming, equipment that failed in specific cold weather ways and needed improvised solutions. The kitchen was the warmest room on the ranch, and it became, without anyone deciding this, a gathering place. Not in a social way. She kept the kitchen functional, not comfortable. But men would drift in on breaks, hold their hands near the stove for a minute, take coffee from the pot she kept going all day, and drift back out. She didn't encourage this, but she didn't discourage it either. She'd learned in her first marriage that a kitchen with the door open was a different kind of home than a kitchen with the door closed, and a ranch was the same. She learned the men more fully in those weeks. Danny Pratt, the youngest, who was 18 and from Missouri, and who was frankly not cut out for ranch work but was too proud to admit it, and who she began assigning small kitchen tasks to on the pretext that she needed help, because his face in the kitchen was more relaxed than his face anywhere else, and she suspected he cooked at home with his mother and missed it. She never said any of this. She just handed him a knife and told him to quarter the turnips. Jed Walsh had a son somewhere in Colorado he didn't talk about, but mentioned once by accident. Wade, she thought the name was. And when he mentioned it, his face did something specific that she recognized and looked away from, because some things you didn't look at directly if you wanted to treat a person with dignity. She started making sure Walsh had coffee before the others in the morning. A small thing, but he noticed. Torres, who'd been one of the skeptics in the first week, and who'd come around after the Cole Barker situation, turned out to have strong opinions about dried beans versus canned, which she agreed with on principle but not always in practice. And they had 3 separate conversations about this over 3 separate weeks, that were the closest things she had to kitchen debates, and which she found she looked forward to. Canned beans are a surrender, Torres said one afternoon in the kitchen on a 10-minute break from fence repair. Canned beans are a tool, she said. Same as any other. You use the right tool for the situation. My grandmother would disagree. Your grandmother probably had more time than I do to soak beans overnight. He conceded the point, but not the principle, and she understood that about him. Gideon she saw every day, but not always at length. He came to the kitchen in the evenings most nights, took coffee, talked about the ranch's operational state, the cattle, the fences, the weather forecasts, things that were going well and things that weren't. She noticed that he'd begun telling her things he probably told Ruck in more detail, not the full picture, but more than the abbreviated employer-employee transaction of those first days. She wasn't sure what to do with that exactly, so she did what she always did with things she wasn't sure about. She paid attention and waited. She was almost through her third week on the ranch when she found the ledgers. She hadn't been looking for them. She was reorganizing the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage, and that she wanted to convert into a proper dry pantry, and in moving a stack of boxes she found, behind them, a wooden crate with no label that contained what turned out to be 2 years of the ranch's account ledgers, apparently put there and forgotten. She should have moved the crate without looking. She looked, not deeply, not at length, just enough to understand what she was looking at. The ledgers were handwritten in 2 different hands, one cramped and careful, one larger and faster, and they told the story of a ranch that had been in reasonable financial health 2 years ago and was now in a position that was more precarious than reasonable. The loan was there. She could see the entry, the amount, the terms. The March deadline was there. And on the last page, a number she hadn't expected. She closed the ledger and put it back in the crate exactly where she'd found it. She stood in the small room for a long moment. The number she'd seen wasn't the loan amount. The loan amount was large but survivable, or looked survivable from the supply side of things she could see from where she stood. The number she'd seen was a second line item, fees it was labeled, to an entity identified only by initials she didn't recognize. And it was recurring, monthly. And it was high enough that if it continued from where it was now to March, the difference between paying the loan and not paying it would be closer than she suspected Gideon knew. She went back to the kitchen, she made dinner, she fed 20 men, she cleaned up. She lay in her room that night with her hands behind her head and stared at the ceiling, and she thought about a lot of things. Thomas, and the note he hadn't told her about, and whether not knowing was a mercy or a cruelty. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "Numbers tell you the truth if you let them." She thought about Gideon Ashcroft asking her weeks ago, "If you saw something in the supply numbers that concerned you, would you tell me?" She'd said yes, especially if you thought I wouldn't want to hear it. She turned over on the narrow cot and closed her eyes and told herself to sleep. She had breakfast in 4.5 hours. She had work to do, but she knew what she was going to have to do tomorrow, and she knew Gideon wasn't going to like it. She was right about that. She told him the next morning, not at breakfast. Breakfast was not the time for conversations that required full attention, not with 20 men coming through and coffee to manage and biscuits in the oven. She waited until the kitchen was cleared and cleaned, until the mid-morning quiet settled over the main house, and then she went to the door of the small office where Gideon did his accounting work and knocked twice. "Come in." He was at the desk with the ledger open, a different one from what she'd found, the current operational one he kept in the desk drawer. He looked up with the expression he had when he was pulled out of numbers, slightly unfocused, then present. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "It's not about the kitchen." He set down his pen. "Sit down." She sat. She put her hands in her lap and looked at him directly and said, "I found the account ledgers, the ones from the last 2 years. They were in a crate behind the boxes in the storage room off the kitchen. I was reorganizing and I moved the wrong box." She paused. "I looked at them. I shouldn't have, and I'm telling you that I did." The expression on his face went through several things quickly. She watched it happen and didn't look away. "How much did you see?" he said. His voice was careful. "Enough to understand the shape of the problem." She kept her tone even. "There's a recurring fee line item in the second ledger, monthly. It's labeled with initials I don't recognize. If that continues at the current rate between now and March, the gap between what the ranch can produce and what the loan requires closes significantly." Silence. Outside, wind moved through the pines at the ridge, the sound of it coming through the walls like something breathing. You got all of that from looking at ledgers you weren't supposed to look at, he said. Not angry. Assessing. Yes. Most people couldn't read a ledger like that. My mother could. She made sure I could. She waited a beat. I'm not asking you to explain the fee line or who the initials belong to. That's your business. I'm telling you what I saw because you asked me to tell you if I saw something that concerned me, and this concerns me. Gideon leaned back in his chair. He picked up the pen he'd set down and turned it in his fingers, not writing, just holding. She'd noticed he did this when he was deciding something. The initials are VPM, he said finally. It stands for Valley Property Management, which is a company that exists on paper in Cheyenne and that exists in practice as Silas Kincaid's method of collecting what he calls a land stewardship fee from ranches that neighbor his holdings. Marin sat with that for a moment. Is that legal? The agreement was signed by my father before I took over the ranch. Something moved across his face, not quite bitterness, but the particular flatness of a man who'd been living with a thing long enough that the anger had worn off and left something quieter behind. My father didn't read it carefully enough. By the time I found out what it was, the agreement had 3 years left, and I didn't have the money to contest it. When does the agreement end? It ended 8 months ago. She looked at him. Kincaid's attorney sent a renewal notice, he said. I didn't sign it. Kincaid has been collecting anyway, through the bank. Patterson at the bank processes it as a standard land fee pool. Either he doesn't know what it is, or he knows exactly what it is. His jaw was tight. I've been fighting it through correspondence for 6 months. His attorney responds, makes reference to terms I don't recognize, and in the meantime, the fee keeps coming out. How much is it per month? He told her the number. It was the number she'd seen in the ledger. Hearing it spoken out loud in this small office made it feel heavier than it had on paper. And the loan principal comes due in March, she said. March 14th. She was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic in her head. Not complicated arithmetic. She'd been working numbers since she was 9 years old, and this was the kind of problem that presented itself clearly once you had the full shape of it. The ranch's income from the cattle sale in fall, minus operating costs, minus the illegal fee that was still being extracted despite the expired agreement, minus the margin she'd seen in the ledger. The gap wasn't unsurvivable, but it wasn't comfortable either. And if Kincaid was doing what she thought he was doing, the discomfort was intentional. He wants the ranch, she said. Gideon looked at her. What makes you say that? The fee is designed to make the loan harder to service. The loan is due in March. If you miss the payment, the bank can move to foreclose. And if Kincaid has a relationship with Patterson at the bank, she stopped. Am I wrong? He was quiet for long enough that she knew she wasn't wrong. He's been after this land for 4 years, Gideon said. My eastern pasture borders his western range. He wants to expand his operation, and the quickest way to do it is through acquisition. The word acquisition came out flat and cold. He offered to buy it twice. I said no twice. So he found another way. He's good at finding other ways. She sat with the full picture for a moment. The ranch, the men, the kitchen she'd rebuilt, the supply system she'd built from scratch, the roundup she'd just gotten 20 men through, all of it sitting on a foundation that had a crack in it she hadn't known about until this morning. What's your plan? She said. I'm working on it. Gideon. She said his name deliberately, the way she'd say it when she needed him to stop the automatic response and think. What's your actual plan? He looked at her. I don't have one yet. That's the honest answer. It was the first time she'd heard him say something like that. The first time the careful, controlled exterior had come apart enough to let something real through. She recognized what it cost him, so she didn't make it worse by reacting to it. All right, she said. Then let me think. She thought for 3 days. She kept it contained, she did her work, she fed the men. She maintained everything that needed maintaining. But the numbers were running in the back of her head the way numbers did when they had her attention, turning over and showing her different sides each time. The problem, stripped to its elements, was this. The ranch needed to service a loan in March. The money to service that loan was being quietly drained by a fee that shouldn't be coming out anymore. The fee was being processed through a bank with a questionable relationship to the man collecting it. And between now and March, Winter would reduce the ranch's income to near zero because cattle sales happened in fall, not winter. Unless she was making bread on the third morning, Wednesday, the bread day. The one day she made enough to last 2 days because the baking took most of the morning, when the piece she'd been missing moved into place. She didn't say anything to anyone that day. She waited until Thursday, when Gideon came for his evening coffee, and she sat down across from him and put a piece of paper on the table between them. "I want you to look at this," she said. He looked at it. It was covered in her handwriting, numbers mostly, organized in columns with small notes alongside. He picked it up, and she watched his face move through the process of reading it. "Walk me through it," he said. "The ranch has approximately 60 cattle that could go to market before the full winter closes the roads," she said. "Not the full herd. You can't sell the breeding stock, and you need to keep enough animals to stay operational next spring, but 60, maybe 65 in the right condition could go. Winter cattle prices are lower than fall prices." "Yes. By how much depends on condition. A healthy animal in good weight sells better in winter than people expect because supply is lower. Most ranches hold their animals and wait for spring, which means the buyers who need winter stock pay a premium for quality." She tapped the paper. "I've been looking at what you have. The animals that didn't go in the fall sale, you kept them because they weren't fully ready yet. But they've had 6 weeks on winter grazing and the feed supplement Ruck's been running, and some of them are ready now." He looked at the numbers again. "The difference between fall price and what I could get now is real, but not as large as you think for the right animals. And it closes the gap." She pointed to the calculation at the bottom of the page. "This column is what the ranch has after operating costs and after the illegal fee, assuming it continues to come out. This column is what you need in March. This column is what 60 good animals at current winter market rates would add." He was very still. "It works?" she said. "Not perfectly. There's not a large margin. But it works. And it removes the scenario where Kincaid's fee makes the difference between making the payment and not making it." Gideon set the paper down. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it, the way a man looks at something he's not sure he trusts yet. "You calculated current winter market rates," he said. "Ruck had the information from the last supply run. There are buyers coming through Caldwell Flats in early December, a purchase agent for a meatpacking operation in Cheyenne. I asked Ruck about it casually. He said the agent pays fair price for quality animals." She paused. "I didn't tell him why I was asking." "Why not?" "Because if I was wrong about the numbers, I didn't want to have raised the possibility unnecessarily." He sat back, turned his coffee cup in his hands. She waited. "If I sell 60 animals now," he said slowly, "I'm thinning the herd going into the hardest part of winter. That's a risk. If we lose animals to cold or disease on top of that, yes, that's the risk." She didn't soften it. "You'd be selling from a position of current strength to address a threat that's still 3 months away. If conditions change badly between now and March, you'd be in a worse position than if you'd held everything. I'm not pretending that's not true." "So it's a gamble." "Everything is a gamble. The question is which gamble?" She met his eyes directly. "Right now you're gambling that you can fight the fee extraction through correspondence and arrive at March with enough to make the payment. That gamble depends on Patterson at the bank and Kincaid's attorney doing something they have no apparent motivation to do." He was quiet. "The other gamble depends on your cattle, your range conditions, and a purchase agent in Caldwell Flats. Those are things you know. Those are things you can influence." She picked up the paper and put it back in front of him. "I know which gamble I'd take, but it's your ranch." Gideon looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You figured all of this out in 3 days," he said. "I had good numbers to work from. Ruck keeps clean records." "Ruck keeps clean records. You turned them into a strategy." He wasn't saying it as a compliment exactly. He was saying it the way he said most things, as an observation. But there was something underneath it that she heard clearly enough. "I grew up doing math at a kitchen table," she said. "My mother would have had this in an afternoon." "Your mother sounds formidable." She was. Marin looked at the paper. "She would have also told me this was none of my business, and I should have moved the crate without looking." Something shifted in Gideon's face. Not quite a smile. He rarely got all the way to a smile. but the closest thing to warmth she'd seen in his expression since that first night in the kitchen. And yet, she agreed. He stood up and took the paper with him. I need to look at the herd numbers with Ruck. Check the specifics against what he knows about the individual animals. He paused at the door. This stays between us for now. Of course. He left. She sat with her cold coffee and thought about her mother's voice saying, "You fix things, Marin, before you even know you're doing it." And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel any particular need to argue with that. Silas Kincaid arrived on a Tuesday 9 days later in a buggy that was too fine for the road conditions and driven by a man in a coat that said he was paid to look intimidating. Marin was in the kitchen when she heard the wheels on the frozen ground, heard the different quality of the approaching sound, not a ranch wagon, something lighter and faster. And she moved to the kitchen window the way she moved to any source of information, automatically, without making it a production. The man who climbed out of the buggy was not what she'd built in her imagination. She'd built something large and obviously threatening, the kind of villain that announced itself. Kincaid was medium height, slim, dressed in a dark coat that was expensive but not showy, with a face that was pleasant enough in the way that some faces were pleasant without being warm. He had the look of a man who smiled often and meant it rarely, and who had learned that the smile covered most of what he needed to cover. He looked at the ranch with the expression of a man taking inventory of something he expected to own. Ruck came out from the barn. She couldn't hear the exchange from the kitchen window, but she could read the posture of it. Ruck polite, as he was always polite, and unhappy underneath it, as he was when something interfered with work. The man in the coat stayed at the buggy. Kincaid gestured toward the main house. She went back to the stove and stayed there. 20 minutes later, Gideon came to the kitchen doorway. His face was the controlled flat she recognized from the evening he'd talked about the loan. "Kincaid is in my office," he said. "I heard him arrive. He says he's here to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding the land. Those are his words." He stopped. "I'm going to tell him the situation with the fee is being addressed legally, and that I'm not interested in a land sale." "All right." He didn't leave immediately. She turned to look at him. "You should know," he said, "that the cattle sale is confirmed. Ruck and I went through the herd 2 days ago. We've got 63 animals that are ready and priced correctly. The purchase agent confirmed he's coming through Caldwell Flats on the 16th. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Good. It's not done yet." "No, but it's moving." He nodded. "Stay as a kitchen." It wasn't dismissive. It was the voice he used when he was protecting something. "This won't take long." She stayed in the kitchen. She put a pot of coffee on because she always put coffee on when she needed to do something with her hands. She listened to the sound of the house, the way sound traveled through old walls, and she could hear nothing specific from the office, just the occasional register of voices that told her the conversation was happening but not what was in it. It lasted 40 minutes. When Kincaid came back through the main hall, she was standing at the kitchen door with a dish towel in her hands. She'd been drying the morning's cups, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His were pale, she noticed, a light blue that read cold rather than clear. He looked at her the way men like him looked at women in kitchens, a quick scan, assessment, dismissal. She was staff, she was furniture. She was irrelevant to the business he was here for. He went out without speaking to her, and she listened to the buggy pull away on the frozen road. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked tired in a specific way. Not physically tired, the other kind, the kind that came from sustained, controlled tension releasing all at once. "How did it go?" she said. He made an offer. He sat down at the work table. She poured coffee without asking and set it in front of him. Generous offer, more than the land is worth at current assessment. But I said no." He wrapped both hands around the cup. He wasn't surprised. He said he hoped I'd reconsider before the spring, when the financial picture might look different. He said the last part precisely, the way you quoted someone you wanted to quote exactly. He knows about the loan. He knows about the loan. Marin sat down across from him. "Patterson. Almost certainly." His jaw was tight. "He knows the payment is due in March, and he thinks he knows whether I can make it." "Does he know about the cattle sale?" "No?" Gideon looked at her steadily. That's still between us and Ruck. She turned her cup in her hands, thinking. He'll find out eventually, when the purchase agent comes through. By then it'll be too late for him to interfere with it. Are you sure of that? He paused. What are you thinking? I'm thinking a man who's been running this play for 4 years doesn't make a personal visit just to make an offer and accept a number. He made the visit because he wanted to see the current state of things. She was working it out as she said it, which was how her thinking sometimes happened. She needed to speak it to see it clearly. He looked at this ranch when he drove in. He's going to go back and think about what he saw and whether it matches what he expected. And what did he see? A ranch that's more operational than he expected it to be this late in the season. Men who look like they've been eating properly. Fences that have been maintained. She paused. He came expecting to find something worse than this. Gideon was quiet, turning that over. The sale needs to happen before he can find a way to create a problem with it, she said. Not necessarily before he finds out, but before he can act on what he knows. That means moving faster than the original timeline if possible. The purchase agent's date is set. Can it move earlier? He looked at her for a moment. I'd have to contact him. Ruck could ride to Caldwell Flats tomorrow. Something moved in Gideon's expression. Not surprise exactly. She thought she was past the point of surprising him, but something that looked almost like the relief of a man who'd been figuring alone and had suddenly found someone figuring alongside him. You're not just the cook, he said. It came out quiet, almost to himself. I'm absolutely just the cook, she said. I have dinner to start in an hour. He almost smiled. Almost. I'll send Ruck in the morning. The temperature dropped 12 degrees the following week. It came in fast and mean the way Wyoming weather sometimes did. Not gradual, but sudden. A shift that turned the already cold ranch into something that required full defensive measures. Extra feed for the cattle, men working in shorter rotations to prevent frostbite. Extra fuel brought to every building, every water trough checked twice a day for ice that formed faster than it should. Marin adapted the kitchen to the cold the way she adapted to everything, by observing what it required and providing it. Hot food every meal without exception. Coffee running all day. She added rendered fat to the biscuit recipe to increase caloric density. She made sure the men going out in the worst conditions ate something hot before they left, even if it was just broth and bread, because she knew what cold did to a body that wasn't fueled, and she wasn't going to have a man going down on her watch. Danny Pratt came in one morning with the beginning of frostbite on 2 fingers, pale and waxy at the tips, which she caught when she handed him his coffee and saw his hand. Come here, she said. It's nothing, he said. Come here, Danny. She had him sit down and she warmed his hand slowly, the right way, not in hot water but in her own hands, and then in cool water, working gradually because frostbite that was warmed too fast did damage. He sat with the particular embarrassed stillness of an 18-year-old being looked after, and she talked to him about the beans versus canned debate she'd been having with Torres, and he gradually relaxed. You need better gloves, she said when the fingers were back to normal color. I know. Tell Ruck. That's not optional, Danny. That's a medical thing. He'll think I can't handle the cold. She looked at him directly. He'll think you need better gloves. Which is true. It doesn't say anything about you. She paused. Ruck's had frostbite twice in his life. He's told me about it. He won't think less of you for asking. Danny looked at her with the expression she'd seen from him before, the one that said she'd said something he'd needed to hear and didn't know how to respond to. Yes, ma'am. And eat more breakfast. You're not eating enough in the morning for what you're doing out there. He started eating more breakfast. The purchase agent arrived on the 14th, 2 days earlier than the original date. Ruck had ridden to Caldwell Flats and negotiated the date change with a bottle of Gideon's Good Whiskey and an explanation about weather windows, which was true enough. The agent was a heavy-set man named Copley, who wore a buffalo coat and had the quick, efficient energy of someone who moved through a lot of ranches in a short time and didn't want to waste either party's time. He walked the 63 animals in the east pasture with Gideon and Ruck, took his time about it, running his hands over flanks, checking teeth, assessing weight with the practiced eye of someone who'd been doing this for years. Marin watched from the fence line. She'd gone out on the pretext of checking whether the outdoor water trough near the pasture needed attention, which it didn't, but she needed to see. Copley made his offer. She couldn't hear the number from where she stood, but she could read Gideon's posture, not the immediate acceptance of a desperate man, but the measured consideration of someone with a real position to negotiate from. They went back and forth twice. She watched Gideon stand his ground on the second round and watched Copley consider and then nod. And she knew from the handshake that followed that the number was close to what she'd calculated. She went back to the kitchen before they came in from the pasture. An hour later, Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked different from how he'd looked for weeks. Not relaxed exactly, because relaxed wasn't a word she associated with him, but like something that had been pulled tight had been let out a turn. "It's done," he said. "I heard the handshake from across the yard." He looked at her steadily. "The number's good, Marin. It covers the loan with enough left to handle operating costs through to spring." She nodded. She kept her face practical because she thought he needed practical right now more than he needed anything else. "That's what I calculated," she said. "You calculated it 3 weeks ago when I didn't have a plan." "You had a plan. You just needed someone to run the numbers on it." He opened his mouth and then closed it, and she thought he was going to say something significant. And then Ruck appeared behind him in the doorway with the paperwork from Copley, and the moment passed into business, which was probably the right thing for it to pass into. She turned back to the stove. The cattle would be collected in 4 days. The money would clear before the end of the month. March 14th was still weeks away, but the shape of it had changed entirely, from a cliff edge to just another date on a calendar, a payment that would be made and a debt that would be cleared, and a man who'd spent 4 years trying to take this ranch, who would have to go home and think of another way. She put more wood in the firebox and started on dinner. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving snow sideways against the kitchen window. She could hear the men coming in from the pasture, boots on the frozen ground, voices short and purposeful in the cold. 20 men who needed feeding, a ranch that was still standing. It was enough. For now, it was enough. But she knew, even as she worked, that Silas Kincaid didn't take a loss and simply walk away. She'd seen his eyes for that half second in the hallway, that pale cold blue, and what she'd seen in them wasn't the look of a man who accepted no. She added salt to the pot and kept her hands moving and told herself she was overthinking it. She didn't entirely believe herself. Kincaid's next move came not through the bank but through the county land office, and it came quietly, the way his moves apparently always came. Not a frontal assault, but a side door, and by the time Gideon found out about it, it had already been in motion for 2 weeks. A man named Aldridge from the county assessor's office arrived on a Wednesday morning in late December, riding a gray horse and carrying a leather satchel that had the look of official business. Marin was at the kitchen window when he came through the gate, and she watched Ruck intercept him in the yard with the posture of someone who hadn't been expecting company. She kept her hands in the bread dough and watched. The conversation in the yard lasted 10 minutes. Aldridge produced documents from the satchel. Ruck's posture changed, not dramatically, but she knew Ruck's posture now, and she could read the shift. He brought Aldridge to the main house, and she heard the knock on Gideon's office door, heard the muffled exchange of voices, heard the door close. She worked the dough. An hour later, Ruck came to the kitchen. He sat down at the work table without being invited, which was unusual. Ruck always asked before he sat, some ingrained courtesy that he'd never explained. The fact that he didn't ask this time told her something before he said a word. "There's a boundary dispute," he said. She shaped the dough into loaves without stopping. "What kind?" "Kincaid's filed a claim with the county assessor saying the eastern fence line is 80 yards inside what should be his property line. He's got a survey, a new one, done last month, that supports it." "And the original survey?" "Says different, but it's 30 years old." Ruck put both hands flat on the table. "If the county accepts Kincaid's survey, we lose a strip of the eastern pasture. Not large in raw acreage, but it's the strip where the creek runs." She stopped. "The water access. Without that creek access, about a third of the eastern pasture becomes unworkable in summer. We'd have to run a pump system or haul water, which costs money we don't have and time the men don't have." She stood there for a moment with flour on her hands, looking at the loaves in front of her without seeing them. "He planned this." "He planned this," Ruck agreed. "The cattle sale. He found out about it. Maybe from Copley, maybe from someone in Caldwell Flats who saw the purchase agent come through. He knew it would close the loan gap, and the March approach wasn't going to work anymore." She was working through it out loud, the way she did when the shape of something was becoming clear. "So he shifted. Filed the boundary claim before the loan payment date, so there's a new problem even after the financial one is resolved. Ruck looked at her with the steady gaze she'd come to understand was his form of agreement. "Where's Gideon?" she said. "Still with Aldridge. The man's got a lot of paperwork." She washed her hands, dried them on her apron. "When Aldridge leaves, tell Gideon I'd like to speak with him when he has a moment." Ruck stood up. "Marin?" He rarely used her first name. It was usually Mrs. Holloway, carried from their first introduction and maintained out of habit or respect or both. The shift was deliberate. "He's going to be angry when Aldridge goes. Not at you, just angry. He does that quietly, which is sometimes harder to be around than the loud kind." "I know," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He went out and she went back to the bread, and she thought about creek water and survey lines and a man with pale blue eyes who didn't accept no. Gideon was in fact angry. He came to the kitchen 2 hours after Aldridge rode out, and his face had the particular compression of someone who had done the work of not showing what he was feeling and was tired from the effort of it. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him and waited. "You heard?" he said. "Ruck told me the shape of it. The boundary claim is, it's well constructed. New survey, registered surveyor with a clean record, filed through the proper county channel. If the county assessor accepts it, we'd need to contest it in court, and a court case takes months and costs money." He stopped. "It's the creek." "I know. Without the creek access, I know, Gideon." He looked at her. The anger in his face was the quiet kind Ruck had warned her about. Not explosive, not directed outward, but present, like a pressure in a sealed space. "He waited until the loan was handled. He waited until I thought—" He stopped again. His jaw worked slightly. "He waited until you had one problem solved," she said, "and then gave you another one." "Yes, that's what he did." "I can't fight a boundary dispute and run a ranch through the hardest part of winter at the same time. Not without—" He picked up the coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "The legal costs alone would put us back in the position we spent 3 weeks climbing out of." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. She'd been thinking since Ruck had told her, and she had something. But it wasn't finished yet, and she needed to be careful about bringing a half-formed thing to a man who was already stretched. "Do you have your father's original survey documents?" she said. "In the strongbox. Why? And records of where the eastern fence was built? When it was put up, who built it? The original line is marked." He was watching her now. "There'd be something in the old records. My father kept notes on the construction work. 30 years of consistent fence use is a legal argument. I don't know the specifics of Wyoming property law well enough to know how strong an argument, but consistent and uncontested use of a boundary for 3 decades is not nothing." She kept her voice careful. She was presenting a direction, not a solution. "If Kincaid's new survey contradicts 30 years of established use, that's a counter-argument. It doesn't win the case for you, but it might make the assessor take longer before accepting the claim is filed." Gideon was still. "Where did you learn property law?" "I didn't. I learned that my neighbor in Laramie had a fence dispute with the family to his north, and he kept the fence because the court said 25 years of use established the practical boundary." She paused. "I also learned that the county assessor doesn't like making rulings that get overturned on appeal. They're cautious. Give them a reason to be cautious, and they'll slow the process down. Which buys time. Which buys time for you to find a lawyer who can do the real work." He looked at the table between them. She could see him running it, testing the logic, looking for the places where it failed. That was his mind. Methodical, honest, not given to optimistic leaps, but capable of clear analysis when the anger wasn't in the way. "The old records are in the strongbox," he said, "and there'd be more in the back files. I haven't touched those in years. Let me look at them." He looked up. "Marin, I found the financial problem in a ledger I wasn't supposed to read," she said, without apology. "You can tell me to stay in my lane, and that's a fair thing to tell me, and I will. Or you can let me look at the records, because I'm good at reading records, and I'll tell you honestly what I see." A long pause. "The files are in the back room," he said. "The wooden crate, not the metal one." She stood up. "After dinner." "After dinner," he agreed. She went back to the stove, and he sat there for another minute in silence. And she didn't look at him because she thought he needed the minute without being looked at. She spent 4 nights on the files. After the kitchen was clean and the prep was done and the ranch had gone quiet, she sat at the work table with a lamp and the contents of the wooden crate spread around her, moving through documents with the systematic patience her mother had taught her, not reading for what she wanted to find, but reading for what was actually there, which was a different thing and a harder one. What was actually there was better than she'd hoped and more complicated than she'd expected. The original survey was dated 1847, done by a surveyor named Pruitt, whose credentials were listed on the document in careful copperplate. It described the eastern boundary by reference to a series of natural markers, a rock formation at the northern end, a dead cottonwood at the southern end, and the creek itself as a reference point. The fence had been built in 1851, documented in her father's construction notes in his cramped handwriting. Garrett and Sons contracted for eastern line, 8 days, finished to the survey markers. 32 years of fence, the same line, maintained and repaired and documented in the maintenance records she found in a separate bundle. Not complete records, but enough. Enough to show that the line had been treated as the boundary consistently without any counterclaim until now. Kincaid's survey, which Aldrich had left a copy of, placed his claim 80 yards west of the creek. That meant he was claiming the creek itself was on his side of the boundary, which was what made it about water access and not just acreage. She sat with the two surveys side by side on the third night and looked at them for a long time. There was something wrong with Kincaid's survey. She couldn't name it exactly. She wasn't a surveyor and didn't have the technical vocabulary for it, but the reference points it used were different from the Pruitt survey's reference points. Not overlapping and disagreeing, different. It used a road junction as a reference that hadn't existed in 1847. A junction that she could see from the construction dates in the old files had been cut through in 1863, 12 years after the fence was built. She wrote that down carefully. On the fourth night, she organized everything into a sequence. The 1847 survey, the 1851 construction notes, the maintenance records, the timeline of the road junction that Kincaid's survey used as a reference, and her written analysis of the discrepancy. And she put it in order and went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. In the morning, she brought it to Gideon. He read it slowly. She did the breakfast service, managed the morning, came back and found him still at the table with the documents, and she poured fresh coffee and sat down across from him. The reference point issue, he said without preamble. If Kincaid's surveyor used a road that didn't exist at the time of the original boundary establishment, then his survey isn't establishing a historical boundary. It's establishing a new one and calling it historical. She kept her voice even. I don't know if that's fraud exactly. I don't know the legal term, but it's a discrepancy that a lawyer could work with, and it's a discrepancy that might make the county assessor unwilling to accept the claim without more review. Gideon looked at the document she'd written. His handwriting was on it in the margins. He'd been annotating while she managed the kitchen, adding context she didn't have. There's a lawyer in Cheyenne named Harfield, he said. He handled the original agreement dispute, the fee extraction. He knows the Kincaid situation. He paused. He's not cheap. No. But a court case is more expensive than a lawyer's consultation. She touched the edge of the document. You don't need to win in court right now. You need to slow the assessor down long enough for a lawyer to make the discrepancy argument properly. That's a shorter and cheaper engagement. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not the measuring look he'd started with when she first arrived, not the careful employer-employee calibration she'd felt in those first weeks. Something that had less distance in it. You did this in 4 nights, he said, after a full day of work. It's not that complicated if you know how to read documents. Marin. He said her name the way he'd said it the first night. Settled, deliberate. Stop deflecting. She looked at him. He held her gaze. You didn't have to do this, he said. This is far outside what I hired you for, far outside what anyone would expect from you, and you've been doing it. The finances, the cattle strategy, now this, without being asked, without complaint, and without taking credit for any of it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the December light was low and white, the kind of light that made the snow look flat and the sky look close. I know what it looks like when something is heading toward a cliff, she said finally. I've seen it before. With my own situation, before Thomas died. There were signs I didn't read until it was too late. She paused. I read the signs here. I couldn't not read them. Because of Thomas. Partly. She looked at the documents on the table. And partly because this ranch it's working. The men are working. What you've built here is real, and it deserves not to be taken by a man who uses paper and lawyers the way other men use violence. She stopped. I didn't come here planning to get involved in any of this. I came here to cook. You came here because you were starving beside a dead bush on a Wyoming road. That too. He almost smiled. The almost smile had become familiar to her by now, the way a lot of things about him had become familiar. The pen he turned in his hands when he was thinking, the way he poured his own coffee when he was restless, the particular silence he kept that was different from the silence of men who had nothing to say. I'll write to Harfield today, he said. I'll send this with the letter. Good. He gathered the documents into an order and then looked up. Marin, for what it's worth. He stopped, started again, and she could see that starting again cost him something. I'm glad I came around that bend in the road when I did. She looked at him for a moment. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled like coffee and the bread she'd put in the oven an hour ago. So am I, she said. It was the truest thing she'd said in months, and she meant it in more ways than she was ready to examine. January came in hard and stayed that way. The cold that had arrived in December deepened rather than easing, the kind of sustained freeze that tested everything: equipment, animals, buildings, and people. 3 of the water troughs froze solid overnight twice in the same week, despite the men checking them morning and evening. A section of the north fence came down under the weight of ice-laden snow, which meant half a day's work in brutal conditions to put it back up before the cattle found it. One of the horses developed a respiratory illness that required Ruck's careful attention for 2 weeks before it resolved. Marin added hot broth to the midday provisions. She doubled the fat content in the working food. She kept the kitchen going from before 4 in the morning until after 9 at night, and she didn't complain about it because complaining was something you did when you had a better option, and this was the only option there was. The men's bodies told her things. Jed Walsh's joints were worse in the deep cold. She could see it in how he moved in the morning, the extra deliberateness of his first hour before the warmth of the kitchen got into him. She started making sure he was one of the first through the line, and she started making sure there was always something warming on the back of the stove that he could pour himself without asking, a thick beef tea that cost almost nothing to make, and that she'd seen her mother make for her father on the cold mornings of her childhood. Walsh never mentioned it directly, but one morning he came in early and she handed him the cup before he'd even sat down, and he looked at her with the look she'd learned to recognize from the men. The look that wasn't gratitude exactly, because men like Jed Walsh didn't do gratitude easily, but was something adjacent to it, something that said, I see what you're doing, and I want you to know I see it. Cold one, he said, meaning the morning. Cold one, she agreed. He sat down and drank his beef tea, and that was the entirety of the exchange, but it was complete. Danny Pratt had started coming to the kitchen in the evenings. Not every evening, and not to talk. He'd find a reason. A cup left behind, or a question about the next day's schedule, transparent pretexts that she accepted without comment because she understood what they actually were. He was 18 and from Missouri, and he missed his family, and the winter was long, and the kitchen was warm, and she was the only woman on the ranch. She didn't make it a thing. She just made sure there was usually something to eat in the evenings, a leftover biscuit or a bowl of something from dinner. And when Danny appeared, she handed it to him without making him ask, and he ate it. And sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't. One evening he said, out of nowhere, "Did you always know you wanted to cook?" She considered the question honestly because Danny asked honest questions and deserved honest answers. No, I cooked because it was the thing there was to do. My mother cooked, I learned from her, it was the most useful thing I knew how to be. But you're good at it, really good. He said it with the slight awkwardness of a young man paying a compliment and not being sure he'd done it right. It's different from how Devereaux did it. Different how? He thought about it. Devereaux made food. You make... He stopped, searching for the word. You make it feel like somebody cares. She looked at him for a moment, this 18-year-old from Missouri who was too soft for ranch work but too proud to go home, and she thought that was one of the more perceptive things anyone had said to her in a long time. Go to bed, Danny, she said. 4:30 comes early. He went, and she stood in the kitchen alone for a moment with his words sitting in the air. You make it feel like somebody cares. She thought about the dead bush on the Wyoming road and the question Gideon Ashcroft had asked her out of nowhere on a frozen November afternoon. She thought about what she'd expected when she'd climbed into that wagon: shelter, wages, a temporary floor under a life that had been falling. She hadn't expected to care about a ranch. She hadn't expected to care about 19 men whose names she now knew, whose patterns and preferences and small dignities she now understood. She hadn't expected to find herself spending her nights reading land surveys to protect something that wasn't technically hers. But that was the thing about caring. It didn't ask your permission before it happened. Harfield's response arrived in the second week of January, a letter that Ruck brought back from the Caldwell Flats post along with the supply order. Gideon brought it to the kitchen and read it there, standing at the counter, which was where he'd started doing his reading when something was important enough that he wanted the kitchen around him while he read it. She noticed this and said nothing about it. He read it twice. Then he set it down. Harfield says the reference point discrepancy is significant, more significant than I thought. He looked at the letter. A survey that relies on a road junction that postdates the original boundary establishment is legally problematic in Wyoming. There's precedent from a case in 1871 where a similar situation was argued, and the court ruled that boundaries had to be established by reference to landmarks that existed at the time of the original survey. That's the argument, she said. Harfield is writing to the county assessor. He says it's unlikely the assessor will move forward with the claim in its current form once the discrepancy is formally raised. He paused. He also says that if Kincaid knew about this when he filed, and Harfield thinks he probably did, there may be grounds for a bad faith filing claim. She was quiet. It means the boundary dispute is effectively stopped, Gideon said. At minimum, delayed long enough that it won't touch this winter or the March payment. At maximum, he stopped. Harfield thinks Kincaid may drop it entirely rather than expose the survey issue in a formal proceeding. Outside, the January wind was working at the kitchen window in its steady way, and somewhere across the yard she could hear the sound of the men moving between the barn and the bunkhouse, the ordinary sounds of the ranch at midday. "It's not over," she said. "Kincaid doesn't stop." "No, but it's a setback he'll have to regroup from." He looked at her. "This started with you reading the survey at night after a 14-hour workday. It started with your father keeping good records in 1851. He made a sound that was closer to an actual laugh than anything she'd heard from him before. Short and real and surprised, like it had come out before he'd decided to let it. She looked at him, and he looked back, and for a moment the kitchen was just the two of them, in the way it had increasingly become. Not uncomfortable, not complicated, just the two of them in a warm room with coffee and a problem that had just gotten smaller. "Thank you," he said, not the way employers thanked staff, the other way. She turned back to the stove before her face did anything she'd have to account for. "Lunch is in 30 minutes. The payment went to the bank on March 11th, 3 days before the deadline. Gideon rode to Caldwell Flats himself to deliver it directly to Patterson's window, which was deliberate. He wanted to hand the money to the man who'd been processing Kincaid's unauthorized fees, wanted Patterson to understand in person that the play had failed. He came back that afternoon with the receipt in his breast pocket and walked into the kitchen and put it on the counter without a word. She looked at it. The amount, the date, the official stamp. "Done," she said. "Done." He took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door, something he'd started doing weeks ago without either of them remarking on it. Harfield's letter came this morning, too. Kincaid's attorney has formally withdrawn the boundary claim, pending further survey review, which Harfield says is language that means they're not coming back with it. She stood with her hands around her coffee cup. Outside the window, the March sky was the pale, flat blue of a winter releasing its grip, not warm yet, but lighter. The specific quality of light that came before the cold broke for real. "It's over," she said. "This part of it." "This part," she agreed. She looked at him. "He'll try something else eventually. Maybe. But this ranch will be here when he does." He said it with a certainty that was different from before. Not the controlled flatness of a man managing his fear of the alternative, but the actual certainty of someone who'd stood on solid ground long enough to believe in it. "We'll be here." "We." He said it without appearing to notice he'd said it, and she didn't point it out, and the words sat in the kitchen between them, and neither of them moved to do anything about it. She went back to the stove. He picked up the receipt and folded it into his pocket and poured himself more coffee and stayed, the way he'd been staying for weeks. Not because there was a reason to stay, not because they always had things to say to each other, but because the kitchen was where they both were, and that had become its own kind of reason. The fire in the stove was steady. The ranch outside was alive with the sounds of ordinary work, and Maren Holloway, who had come to this place with nothing but a broken strapped bag and the distant memory of who she'd been before everything fell apart, stood in the kitchen she'd made her own and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could accurately remember. Not safety, exactly. Not happiness, which was still a word that felt too large and too unguarded. But close. Getting closer. The stew needed salt. She added it, tasted it again, and it was right. Spring on the Wyoming frontier didn't arrive so much as it negotiated. It came in increments. A day that was almost warm, followed by 3 days that weren't. Mud that froze overnight and softened again by noon. Snow that fell in April with the casual indifference of a season that hadn't finished yet, and knew it. The ranch moved through this uncertain transition the way it moved through everything, by adjusting, improvising, and continuing. Maren adjusted with it. She shifted the menu toward lighter fare as the temperature allowed, brought in the first dried goods of the new season's order, reorganized the cold room as the natural refrigeration of deep winter gradually became unreliable. She noted the changes in the men, too. A loosening that came with longer light, a willingness to linger over coffee in the morning rather than hurrying out into darkness, a quality of movement that was less defended against the cold and more just movement. The ranch breathed differently in spring. She hadn't expected to notice that, or to care about it, but she did. March 14th had come and gone. The loan receipt was in Gideon's strongbox. Harfield had confirmed in writing that Kincaid's boundary claim was withdrawn, the survey discrepancy formally noted in the county record in a way that would make refiling the same argument legally difficult. The VPM fee had stopped appearing in the bank statements the month after Gideon delivered the loan payment personally to Patterson's window. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just an absence where the extraction had been, which Harfield said was exactly what he'd expected, and which meant they'd decided the exposure wasn't worth the amount. It wasn't a complete victory in any clean sense. Kincaid still owned the land to the east. Patterson still ran the bank in Caldwell Flats. The world that had produced the problem hadn't changed, but the immediate threat had receded, and the ranch stood intact on the other side of a winter that had tried in multiple ways to bring it down, and that was real. What Maren hadn't fully anticipated was what came after the crisis ended. When survival is the organizing principle of every day, it fills the available space entirely. You don't think about what you want or what you feel or what you're building toward. You think about the next meal, the next supply order, the next problem. It's an efficient way to live in the short term, and it keeps certain things from being examined, which is part of its appeal. The crisis ending removed that efficiency. And in the quiet that followed, certain things moved into the space the crisis had occupied and asked to be looked at. She noticed it first on a Tuesday evening in late March, when the kitchen was clean and the ranch was quiet, and Gideon was at the work table with his coffee, and she was at the stove with nothing urgent to do, and she became aware that she was staying in the kitchen, not because there was work left, but because leaving would mean going to her room alone, and her room alone was not where she wanted to be. She didn't do anything with that awareness. She filed it, the way she filed things that required thought before action, and she went to her room and slept and got up at 4:30 and cooked breakfast and went about her day. But the awareness didn't file away entirely. It stayed in a corner of her mind with the patience of something that knew it could afford to wait. Ruck said something to her in early April that she kept coming back to. They were in the yard, she returning from the supply shed, and he coming from the barn, and they met at the gate the way they often met. Brief, practical, two people who'd developed the shorthand of shared purpose without ever explicitly deciding to. He'd asked about the rosemary in the supply order, whether she'd gotten it, and she'd told him yes, and then he'd paused with his hand on the gate and said, not quite looking at her, "You planning to stay on past summer?" She looked at him. "That's Gideon's decision." "I know whose decision it is. I'm asking what you're planning." She considered the question honestly, which was the only way to answer a question from Ruck. "I haven't thought past summer in specific terms." "Maybe think about it," he said, and went through the gate and across the yard, and that was the end of the conversation in the way that all of Ruck's conversations ended, with the last word belonging to the point he was making and not to himself. She stood there for a moment with the rosemary under her arm and thought, what exactly is he telling me? She knew what he was telling her. She'd known for a while, probably. Ruck was not a man who said things without meaning them precisely. The question was what she was going to do with the knowing. Sham. The thing about grief was that it didn't leave on schedule. Maren had understood this in the abstract since the first weeks after Thomas died, when well-meaning people in Laramie had said things like, you'll feel better by spring, and time heals, with the confidence of people who'd never had to test those phrases against anything real. She'd understood in the abstract that grief had its own clock, that it showed up unexpectedly and left without announcing its departure and came back when it felt like it. What she hadn't fully understood was that grief and feeling alive were not in fact mutually exclusive, that you could miss someone you'd loved and still feel the pull of what was in front of you, that honoring a loss didn't require treating everything that came after as lesser or as disloyalty. Thomas would have liked this ranch. That was the thought she had one morning in April, watching the men move through the yard in the early light, the whole operation running with a competence and rhythm she'd helped build. He'd have liked the scale of it, the seriousness with which Gideon ran it, the way Ruck managed the men without theater. He'd have had opinions about the cattle selection. He'd have gotten along with Walsh. The thought came without the old accompanying weight. It came and sat and was true, and she let it be true without apologizing to it, or using it to wall off what was also true, which was that she was 40 yards from a man who had asked her to stay in his kitchen and kept finding reasons to remain in that kitchen long after the coffee was cold. She was not 20 years old. She'd had a marriage and a farm and a loss and a year of near ruin and 5 months of rebuilding something that belonged to someone else on a piece of Wyoming frontier that had tried to kill her before she'd even arrived. She was not going to pretend the situation was simpler than it was or feel things at a pace she hadn't chosen. But she was also not going to keep filing the awareness in a corner indefinitely. Gideon said it on an evening in late April, which was not a dramatic evening in any external sense. The weather had been reasonable. Dinner had gone well. The men had gone to the bunkhouse. The kitchen was clean. He'd been at the work table longer than usual, which she'd noticed, and she'd been finding small things to do that kept her in the kitchen, which she'd also noticed about herself and chosen not to address. She was drying the last of the cups when he said, without preamble, I need to say something. She set down the cup and the cloth and turned around. He was looking at her directly with the look that meant he'd made a decision and was executing it regardless of how it came out. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing words with the same care he chose everything. Not performing, not rehearsed, just someone who understood that imprecision in an important moment was a kind of disrespect. When I came around that bend in the road in November, he said, I was looking at a ranch that was working but barely. Men who were demoralized, a financial situation I was managing alone, a problem I'd been carrying for 4 years. He paused. I stopped because you looked like you needed help. I asked you to stay because I needed a cook. Those were the honest reasons. I know, she said. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I was about to bring someone onto this ranch who would rebuild the kitchen and fix the supply system and reduce a shoulder dislocation with her bare hands and spend her nights reading land surveys and calculate a cattle strategy in 3 days that I hadn't been able to arrive at in 3 months. He stopped. Something in his face was working, the control he usually kept as a matter of course making an exception. I didn't know I was going to spend 6 months coming to this kitchen in the evenings because the kitchen is where you are. Maren looked at him. I'm not asking you to stay as my cook, he said. You can cook here or not cook here. That's beside the point. I'm asking you to stay because this ranch is different with you on it. And I'm different with you on it, and I don't want to go back to what it was before. And I think you know I'm not good at saying things like this. So I'm saying it anyway, because the alternative is not saying it, and I've been not saying it since January. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the April evening was fading, the sky going from pale blue to the first gray of dusk. She'd known this was coming. She'd known the shape of it for weeks, had felt it building in the long evenings and the easy silences, and the way the word we had started appearing in his sentences without either of them examining it. Knowing it was coming didn't make standing in it simple. It didn't resolve the question of who she was now versus who she'd been. or what she was ready for, or what any of this meant past the immediate warmth of this kitchen and this man and this evening. "I'm not the same person I was before Thomas died," she said. She said it not as a warning, but as the truth she'd been carrying. "I don't know how to explain that clearly, except to say that I came here with almost nothing, and I've been building something from nothing for long enough that I'm not entirely sure what I want looks like anymore. I know what I need. I'm less certain about the rest." "That's fair," he said. "I'm also not 20 years old. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you're saying or that I haven't been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been staying in this kitchen past the point of having work to do, Gideon. You know that." "I know that." "So I'm not—" She exhaled. "I'm not saying no." He looked at her. "I'm saying that I don't want to be the cook who became something more because the winter was hard, and the circumstances made it convenient," she said. "I want to stay because we've looked at each other honestly and decided to, not because I'm here and it's spring and things worked out." "Is that what you think this is?" She looked at him steadily. "No, but I needed to say it out loud." He nodded slowly. "Then say anything else you need to say out loud." She thought about it. The cups were all dried and put away. The stove was banked for the night. Everything in the kitchen was in its place. The place she'd built for it. The system she'd made from chaos. "I want to keep running the kitchen," she said. "That's mine. However this goes, that stays mine. It was always yours. I want to be useful in the ways I'm useful, not just the ways that are expected of me." She said it looking directly at him because it needed to be direct. "I found the financial problem. I worked out the cattle strategy. I read the land surveys. If something matters to this ranch, I want to be part of working on it. I won't be put back in a corner when the crisis is resolved." "I would not put you in a corner," he said. There was a slight edge in his voice that was not offense, more like someone pushing back on a mischaracterization. "Have I ever done that?" She thought honestly. "No." "Then don't ask me to promise not to do something I haven't done." She almost smiled. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the fact that he'd pushed back instead of simply agreeing to anything she wanted to maintain the moment. That was the thing, actually. That was the thing that told her more about who he was than the months of watching him had told her. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll stay," he said carefully. "Or all right, I made a point." "Both," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the almost smile, not the controlled warmth he allowed himself occasionally, but something that was the real version underneath all of that, something that had probably been there for months waiting for an occasion. It wasn't dramatic. It was just him, actually present, not managing anything. "I'm glad," he said. "So am I," she said. And that was that. No grand declarations. No scene. Two people in a kitchen at the end of a long day choosing each other honestly, with open eyes, knowing exactly what had brought them here and choosing it anyway. It would have complications. She knew that. Two people who'd both been alone for significant time, both shaped by losses they'd each carried quietly, both accustomed to handling things without depending on anyone. That was not a recipe for effortless. There would be days when his controlled silence felt like walls rather than just his nature. There would be days when her instinct to solve everything before being asked would chafe against his instinct to manage things alone. They would have disagreements about the ranch and the men and the supply orders, and probably about 100 small things neither of them could predict. That was marriage, or the beginning of it. That was two lives agreeing to share a geography, not just land, but the interior kind, the maps of who you were and where you'd been and what had made you and what you hoped for. She thought about Thomas, briefly, with the gentleness that had replaced the grief's original weight. He had been her first understanding of what it meant to share a life with someone. He'd taught her that ordinary steadiness was worth more than grand gestures, that showing up every day was its own form of devotion, that loving someone was not one continuous feeling, but a series of small decisions made over time. She carried that. She would always carry that. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was just part of her, woven into how she understood things, available to her now in this kitchen with this man in a way it hadn't been in the difficult year after she'd lost him. Thomas had given her what he'd given her. Gideon was something new. Both things were true, and neither one diminished the other. Chirin, she told Ruck the next morning. Not in words exactly. She told him by handing him his coffee before he asked, and looking at him in a way that said what she didn't say. And he looked back at her with the particular Ruck stillness that contained approximately 1,000 things he would never articulate, and he picked up his coffee and said, "Good," and went out to the yard. She stood in the doorway and watched him cross toward the barn, and she felt something move through her that was difficult to name. Not triumph, not the clean relief of a problem solved. Something quieter. The feeling of a ship finding its bearing after long weather. Not arrived yet, but pointed right, the compass steady. Danny Pratt came through for breakfast, and she gave him an extra biscuit without explanation, and he ate it without questioning it, which was the right response. Torres came through, and they had a brief argument about whether the dried beans in the new order were better quality than last month's, which they weren't. And she told him he was right, and he seemed startled to be told he was right, and she made a mental note to do that more often, because a man who was right deserved to be told so. Walsh came in last, as he often did, moving carefully in the way his joints required in the morning. She handed him the beef tea before he sat. He took it and sat and looked at the table and then looked at her. "Something's different," he said. Walsh was like that. He noticed things without making productions of them. "Spring," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the look of a man who'd lived long enough to know when he was being given a partial answer. Then he nodded and turned to his breakfast, and that was that. But the spring work consumed everything for 6 weeks. Calving season, which was the most labor-intensive period on a cattle ranch, demanded attention from every corner of the operation. New animals came into the world in the cold pre-dawn hours and in the middle of the day and at 2 in the morning, each one requiring monitoring, and the men rotated through watches that left everyone perpetually short on sleep. Marin adjusted the kitchen to the schedule, protein at every meal, food available at all hours in a way it usually wasn't, coffee that was continuous rather than timed. She found herself out of the kitchen more than she'd been in the fall and winter, partly because the calving required an extra pair of hands occasionally, and partly because she wanted to understand the full cycle of what the ranch did, not just the part that happened in the kitchen. She helped with 2 difficult births when the experienced hands were elsewhere, holding an animal steady while Ruck worked with the careful speed of a man who'd done this hundreds of times. And she came back to the kitchen afterward with cold hands and something that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. The specific feeling of having been necessary in a way she hadn't expected. Gideon found her washing up afterward and looked at her without saying anything for a moment. "Is that going to be a regular thing?" he said. "I'll be in the kitchen for breakfast in 4 hours, she said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." She dried her hands. "I don't do well with edges I'm not allowed past. You should know that about me." "I'm beginning to know that about you," he said. He said it without complaint, which she appreciated. They were learning each other's shapes that spring, the actual textures of living and working alongside someone, which were different from the managed surfaces of an employer and employee. She learned that he carried the weight of the ranch's history in a way that occasionally made him rigid when flexibility would have served better, and she told him so once, directly, when it cost them a day's work on the fence repair. And he was quiet about it for too long in a way that she recognized as processing rather than resentment. And then he said she was right, which was not easy for him and which she didn't make a scene about. He learned that she sometimes fixed problems without telling him, which came from the survival habits of a woman who'd learned not to depend on anyone. And he told her once, also directly, that fixing things without telling him meant he couldn't see the full picture of what the ranch was dealing with, and she heard him, and she didn't argue, and she worked on it. Not perfectly, not all at once, but genuinely, which was what he'd asked for. They argued about the South Pasture fence line in May, a practical argument about whether to repair or replace, which was also an argument about budget and priorities. And it lasted 3 days and was not pleasant, but was honest. And they came out of it with a plan that incorporated both of their thinking and was better than either of their original positions. Ruck watched the whole thing from a careful distance and said nothing to either of them, which was the wisest possible approach. Décision? On a morning in early June, when the Wyoming spring had finally decided to commit to itself, Marin stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the ranch wake up. It was just past 5. The light was the clean gold of early summer, long and flat across the pasture, catching on the dew and on the backs of the cattle moving slowly in the far field. The bunkhouse door opened and the first of the men came out. Torres, who was always early, heading for the horse barn. Then Danny, who'd grown an inch since November, or she thought he had. Then Walsh, moving at his pace, heading for the kitchen the way he headed for the kitchen every morning. She turned and had his beef tea ready when the door opened. He came in and stopped for just a moment, a pause so brief that anyone who didn't know him would have missed it, and looked at the cup in her hand and at her face. Then he took the cup and sat down and said nothing, which was its own kind of language, and she understood it completely. This was what she'd built. Not the physical kitchen, though that too. The organized shelves and the good running stove and the supply system that meant there was always enough. Not just the meals, though those also. What she'd built was the understanding between people that came from months of showing up, of feeding and being depended on, and occasionally being afraid and doing it anyway. The knowledge that sat in Walsh's hands when he held that cup, that said, "You know me, you knew what I needed before I knew you were watching, and that matters." She had built a family by accident, the way families were mostly built. Not through intention, but through proximity and persistence, and the daily decision to give a damn about the people in front of you. Gideon came in at 5:30. He looked at her from the door the way he'd started looking at her. The look that was different from the measuring look of those first months. That was just him looking at her in the morning before the day had started. Something settled and specific in it. He poured his own coffee and stood at the counter, and they were quiet together in the way they'd learned to be quiet together, which was easy now rather than careful. "Harfield wrote again," he said. "I know, I saw it in the stack. He says the county has formally notated the survey discrepancy in the public record. Kincaid can't file a new boundary claim using the same reference points." He drank his coffee. "He also says Patterson at the bank has taken early retirement." She looked at him. "His replacement is a woman from Cheyenne," Gideon said, "who has apparently been sent by the bank's parent organization to review the practices of several of their Wyoming branches." A slight pause. "Harfield seems to think this is related to the fee extraction issue, which he may have quietly raised with certain people in Cheyenne." "Harfield is a good lawyer," she said. "He's a very good lawyer." Something in his tone said he found this genuinely satisfying, and she didn't blame him. "Kincaid," she said, "we'll try something else eventually. He's that kind of man." He set down his cup. "But not from the position he was in 6 months ago. That's different. The land is secured, the loan is paid, the boundary argument is on record. He'd be starting from a worse position with a less sympathetic county apparatus." She thought about Kincaid's pale eyes in the hallway that day in December, the quick scan that had dismissed her as furniture, as irrelevant. She thought about what it would mean to him to know that the woman he'd looked through had read the land surveys that took down his boundary claim and done the financial calculations that closed the loan gap before he could exploit it. There was no satisfaction in that to present to him. He'd never know, or if he knew, he'd find a way to minimize it. But she knew, and Gideon knew, and Ruck knew, and that was enough. That was actually enough. "I'm going to start the biscuits," she said. He stayed at the counter while she worked, the way he'd been staying for months. She could hear the ranch assembling itself outside. More voices now, the particular sound of morning gathering, 20 men preparing to do the work that kept this place alive. She shaped the biscuits with the unconscious speed of someone who'd done this thousands of times, and thought about the things she'd learned in 5 months on a ranch she'd arrived at near death. She'd learned that survival and living were different things, and that the gap between them was dignity. The insistence on doing things properly, even when no one was watching, on keeping the flour in the right place even when you were too tired to care, on making the biscuits from scratch even when the canned alternative was faster. Dignity wasn't about pride. It was about maintaining the standard that made you recognizable to yourself when everything else was stripped away. She'd learned that the most useful thing she'd ever done wasn't any single dramatic act. Not the shoulder, not the ledger, not the land surveys, but the daily accumulation of paying attention, of knowing Walsh needed beef tea, and Danny needed an extra biscuit, and Torres needed to be right sometimes, of reading the room every morning and adjusting to what it needed. That kind of attention was invisible as long as it was working, and absolutely evident the moment it stopped. It was the most undervalued form of intelligence she knew. She'd learned that home was not a place you owned. She'd lost her understanding of that truth when she'd lost the farm after Thomas died, when she'd stood in the empty house with the bank's notice in her hand and felt the ground go out from under her. She'd thought home was the house, the land, The specific arrangement of spaces she'd made her own. What she understood now was that home was the practice of presence. It was showing up to the same place every day and caring about what happened there. And that practice could be built anywhere, on someone else's land, in a kitchen that belonged to an employer, in a borrowed room with a lock on the door. Home was not something you could lose. It was something you made. And it was something she was still making, here, every morning, in this kitchen that was hers now, in the way that mattered. Gideon was watching her with his coffee. She could feel it without looking. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered answering fully and then decided the full answer was for herself and the short answer was for the morning. "Biscuits," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was a sound she'd come to value more than she could accurately account for. "You're always thinking about biscuits." "I'm always making biscuits. The thinking about them is just what runs alongside." She slid the first tray into the oven and straightened up and looked at him across the kitchen. The morning light was coming through the window now, landing on the counter, on the cups, on the organized shelves that she'd arranged the first week and maintained every day since. On him, standing at the counter with his coffee, unhurried. This was what she'd thought she'd lost when she'd lost the farm. Not the specific house or the specific land, but this. The ordinary morning with someone who knew you, the small commerce of daily life between people who'd chosen each other with clear eyes. She hadn't lost it. She'd lost the location. The rest had been inside her the whole time, waiting for the conditions to reemerge. "The biscuits are in," she said. "Breakfast in 40 minutes. "I know," he said. Outside, the Wyoming morning was fully arrived. Light moving across the pasture, cattle in the far field, the sounds of 20 men at work on a ranch that was still standing, that would still be standing next year and the year after that. Spring on the frontier was never clean or promised or easy. It was just the next season after a hard winter, stubbornly present, doing what seasons did. She turned back to the stove. There was work to do, and she was exactly where she needed to be to do it.